Welcome back. We come now to the final of the 5 plays of Aristophanes in this course. I hope that you have found the plays of Aristophanes as refreshing and enjoyable as I did when I first read them. And of course, all good things have to come to an end, but we finally have to move on to our other 3 authors. But Frogs is a really wonderful play to conclude our survey of Aristophanes with. It is, I think, arguably one of the most brilliantly written pieces of literature there is, and it is a fantastically funny play, and quite ironically represents one of the saddest periods in ancient Athenian history. So as we've been doing, I will relate to you first the background historical information that relates to the production of Frogs, and then we'll take you through Frogs itself so that you can see the connections. And this one, like its predecessor, Lysistrata, is an especially political play and has some very specific comments to make to the Athenian audience about what they should do to improve their state of affairs if they don't want to suffer a dire fate in the war that, as we will discover shortly hereafter, is about to come to a very unhappy conclusion for the Athenians. All right, so what's been going on? In the last video, we reviewed the oligarchic coup, which went from 411 to 409 BC. One of the consequences of the coup was that a group of Athenian statesmen, politicians, and generals who had been involved in the coup were sent into exile. They, however, could potentially have been recalled from exile to serve once again in Athens, including especially as generals, if that were ever to be resolved for the Athenians. Now, Alcibiades, of course, was the general who actually started the coup in the first place, but he had been recalled since then because he had been successful as a general under Athenian command, helping out the Athenians in the years following the initiation of the coup and down into the restoration of Athenian democracy. So he was recalled, but then he was sent into exile again because in 407 BC he suffered another defeat, really the Athenian fleet did, at Notium to the Spartans, and especially the very clever Spartan commander Lysander. As a result, Alcibiades was now in exile again, and this time remained in exile permanently. He did not go back to the Spartan side, however. He became uninvolved in the war, except at a very critical moment in this final battle of the war, Aegospotami, that we'll describe momentarily. So Alcibiades was okay. Theramenes was still involved in Athenian affairs, despite his complicity in the revolted Chios in 412 BC. He served as general ably and continued to serve as a politician in Athens. And he's referred to in Frogs as the politician who could change sides very quickly, just like the actus boot that can be the koturnos, that can be switched from one foot to the other very easily. So Theramenes apparently was quite slick and knew how to get around quite well. And then there's, of course, our fellow Cleophon. Cleophon was the successor to Cleon, Rough, and Hyperbolus, the two action-packed politicians. Cleophon was the one most instrumental in keeping the Athenians in the war despite the possibility of peace, especially in 410 BC when the Athenians scored the major victory at Cyzicus, still under the command of the 5,000. Once that happened, then the Athenians kept on going with the war, and it turned out, as we know, not well for them. But it is possible that they really did genuinely believe that with the uptick going back in their favor, that they really had a chance to finally defeat the Spartans once and for all, and at least save face in the war. So this is the personnel lining up our circumstances for Frogs. So the year before Frogs was produced, 405 BC, so the year before that, 406 BC, it was the unfortunate event of the Battle of Arginusa. This is the one that's referred to. You may remember the slave Xanthias makes a comment to Dionysus at the beginning when he says, "I wish I had fought at sea." And the reason why he says that is that he wants to be able to be a free man and not under Dionysus' control, because Dionysus is making him carry this really big load on his back while he's riding the donkey. and he gets frustrated. And the reason why he spouts that out is that he wanted to fight in this battle but didn't for some reason, because when the Athenians sent the fleet out to the Arginusae Islands, they put everybody on board that they could fit, all their ships who normally wouldn't serve on triremes, and that included slaves who were promised freedom, manumission, if they in fact brought home a victory for the Athenians, which in fact actually happened. So the Arginusae battle happened in 406 BC. It happened because the Spartan fleet blockaded an Athenian fleet near the big island of Lesbos. If you look on your map, you'll see that in the northeast corner, Lesbos, and then the Arginusae Islands to their east, right nearby. The Athenian fleet was blockaded there, but they managed to sneak a ship through the blockade to Athens to warn the Athenians of what was happening, and the Athenians sent another fleet back to help the first one. So, in the battle that ensued, the Athenians successfully beat the Spartans, but in the middle of the battle, there was a big storm. And a lot of these extra people who were on board all these ships who didn't belong there fell overboard, and since they apparently weren't seaworthy, they ended up drowning. It was, of course, a very rough storm, and it may have been impossible to rescue them anyway. But when the Athenians at home heard about this, they immediately put on trial all of the generals who had served there, again, illegally, unconstitutionally. So, although the generals argued their case for what had happened and kept on saying this one was responsible, this one was responsible, eventually the Athenians did actually end up executing them all. And so now you have Alcibiades, who was out in exile because of his involvement with the Spartans, and we now have generals who are in an exile because they will not come home because of the Arginusae battle, and you have generals in exile because of the oligarchic coup. So all of these people are out there who could be helping the Athenians, but they're unavailable for various reasons because they're in exile. That's one of the main themes of Frogs at this point. Now, subsequent to this play came the big disaster at this other location, Aegiospotame. So once again, go to your map. If you already found Lesbos, the really big island up in the northeast Aegean Sea. Right near it is Arginusae. Now go over to the Hellespont, which is that narrow strip of water that's further north from Lesbos. And you should, right there on the narrow strip of water there is Aegiospotame. It may not be listed on your map, but that's where it's located. And in that battle, the Athenians camped out on the beach right opposite a city called Lampsacus that now we have Lysander in command again. He wasn't in command at Arginusae. Lysander on the Spartan side had taken over. So the Athenians were trying to oust the Spartans. But Lysander pulled this trick on the Athenians that he kept on offering battle repeatedly. Well, he would come around from Lampsacus up toward the beach at Aegiospotame across the channel. And when the Athenians came up with their ships to oppose him, they were staring at each other and looked like they were going to lock into a battle, but then didn't. He then disengaged. And he kept doing that a few times until finally the Athenians tried to send some ships past Lysander, but then Lysander caught those, chased them back. Then the Athenians tried to oppose Lysander again, and again he disengaged. Then the Athenians went back to the beach, and then Lysander sent a signal and came in and grabbed the whole fleet. And the vanquishing of the fleet at Aegiospotame cost the Athenians the war finally, because then the Spartans were able to blockade the Piraeus harbor right outside of Athens, and that meant that Athens was helpless, and they would end up surrendering the following year after a very unhappy winter of being besieged by the Spartans. So the Athenians, in fact, are on the brink of disaster at the point when this play is produced. And Aristophanes seems to sense this because there's an unusual urgency that he puts into this play, trying to get the one more time to get the Athenians to pay attention. And once again, as with his previous plays, the Athenians don't listen to what he has to say, and this time it finally cost them dearly. This play was produced in 405 BC and won first place. When the Athenians recovered, as we'll talk about in a later video, from the traumatizing events following their defeat in the Peloponnesian War, they got their democracy back again. They produced this play again, and which was quite unusual to do, and it won first prize again, a second time. And as far as we know, this is the only play that was produced twice and won first place twice. and it may be because the Athenians recognized how brilliantly Aristophanes had foreseen what was actually going to happen. All right, so let's see how this plays out in the actual play itself. Frogs is a rather unusual play once again because we have two different choruses. There is the Frogs chorus itself, the announced one, but then the main chorus turns out not to be the Frogs chorus, but rather the chorus of mystic initiates into the mystery cult of Demeter, the goddess of agriculture, and her daughter Persephone, the daughter of agriculture, but also the underworld goddess, and also Demeter's son Iacchus. All three of them are closely tied with the mystery cult, and they're tied in especially with the planting of crops, and then later on the harvest of those same crops. So it's these mystic initiates who actually meet Dionysus and his slave Xanthias down in the underworld and escort him with singing and dancing to the hall of Pluto. So now the question is, why is Dionysus down there? He is there because he tells us, and he tells his half-brother Heracles at the beginning of the play, that he was on board a ship watching an Athenian sea battle and was reading a play by Euripides called Andromeda. And remember now that Euripides had just passed away the previous year, 406 BC, so he's now in the underworld. So Dionysus wants to get him back because he thinks that Euripides can provide advice to the city of Athens for what they should now do to save themselves in this war that appears to be headed for disaster. So Dionysus is taking his slave Xanthias with them. He meets Heracles in order to get guidance instructions for how to actually get his way down into the underworld, because Heracles had gone there before when he, in his 12th labor, when he was told by his uncle Eurystheus to get the three-headed dog Cerberus to bring it back from the underworld up to the above world to complete Heracles' enslavement of 12 labors. So Heracles, therefore, would know how to get down to the underworld and home again. So Dionysus asks Heracles for advice as to how to go, and Heracles sort of teases him, giving him false things like, hang yourself, jump off a tower, and so on. But then finally does say to Dionysus kind of reluctantly, well, you can do it my way, but it's a very long journey. You got to go this way, and you see a bunch of monsters, and they're all scary, and there's a lot of criminals, and so forth. But he finally does give Dionysus that advice. It's in the middle of the opening conversation between Dionysus and Xanthias, as we mentioned before, where Xanthias makes that passing reference to the sea battle in which he could have actually been free. So Xanthias' presence is a slavish reminder to the Athenians that they in fact had committed quite a terrible wrong with that particular sea battle. Okay, so once Heracles has given Dionysus his directions, Dionysus and Xanthias start to head down to the underworld. There's a little big thing about carrying the baggage down, and they try to get a corpse to do it, but the corpse charges too much money, so he won't do it. So now Dionysus arrives at the river Styx, we presume, and is going to be rowed across by Charon, the ferryman. However, Xanthias, the slave, because he didn't fight in the sea battle, is not allowed to row across, and so he's going to have to walk around the lake. When Dionysus goes across the lake with Charon, that is when the frogs show up. We don't know if the frogs were a real chorus of singers who came on stage, or if it's possible that they were actually singing from off stage. We're not exactly sure which. But in either way, the frogs start singing in a way that interferes with the rowing rhythm that Charon is trying to establish for Dionysus to be able to row the boat successfully across the river. So Dionysus and the frogs get irritated with each other, and they get into this farting contest, and finally Dionysus is able to out-fart the frogs and finally gets himself across the river, probably gratefully. There is a somewhat poignant side to the frogs, however, because while they do get to sing before Dionysus shuts them up, they sing about the pleasant days in which they used to sing in the country. You have to remember, of course, that these are ghost frogs, so they're presumably deceased. And the countryside where they would have been singing is probably the countryside not far from Athens, which, of course, had been ravaged year after year after year by the Spartans as part of the Spartan war strategy in the Peloponnesian War. So the frogs' mention of the countryside is something that although quite humorous in line of all the farting, is probably also a little bit sad for the Athenian audience to listen to, because it reminds them of something that they've lost and now haven't been able to enjoy for a couple of decades due to the war. All right, so once Dionysus gets across and he reunites with Xanthias, who has made his way around the lake, they have a couple of rather unfortunate encounters with a monster called Empusa, and then they then meet the mystic initiates. There's a long dance scene with them. Then they arrive at the Hall of Pluto. Then they get into this thing about switching back and forth. Dionysus is actually dressed up as the god Heracles so that he can make his way down into the underworld successfully. It's kind of strange because Dionysus himself, probably as a god, could have gotten down himself, but instead he thinks he has to dress up as Heracles. And of course he has exactly the opposite temperament of Heracles. He's about as effeminate a god as you can get, and probably is dressed that way. And that's what Heracles laughs at in the opening prologue, is how ridiculous Dionysus looks with the lion skin and the club, probably over yellow saffron or something else that makes Dionysus look very women-like. So now Dionysus gets to the Hall of Pluto, and the guard named Aeacus wants to take him into custody because he stole Cerberus, thinking that he's Heracles. Then there's a couple of things back and forth with slave women, one who thinks that Dionysus is Heracles and the other who thinks that Xanthias is Heracles. And the reason for that is that they are changing costume. Dionysus wants Xanthias to be Heracles, but then takes back the costume and tries to be Heracles again, and then gets Xanthias to be Heracles again. So what's happening there, as the chorus explains in their later parabasis, is that we have a description of the political allegory about constantly changing sides, like Theramenes, for instance. The fact that Athenian politicians could not be trusted in these last several years, because with all of the revolutionary stuff that had happened, especially with the oligarchic coup, the Athenians were finding that their politicians were not trustworthy because they could never be sure of exactly if they really did support Athenian democracy or weren't, whether they were getting ready for, at some point, for another revolution. So this is a period of quite deep and deepening mistrust and suspicion on the part of the Athenians toward their elected political leaders, and it's that mistrust that's reflected in this back and forth game that Dionysus and Xanthias play, as each one takes on the costume of Heracles. So then finally, Aeacus confronts both of them together and gets them into this beating contest, because Aeacus thinks that one is a god and one is not, and he can't tell which one is actually the god. Turns out that both of them start screeching in pain. Now, Xanthias is a human, and you would expect that as he's getting beaten on his back, but Dionysus is a god, and he still screeches in pain. So it gets Aeacus confused, and he finally has to take them in to where they wanted to go anyway, which was to Pluto, to finally straighten out exactly what they're doing there and who exactly is who. All right, so now we finally come to the really important part of the play, which involves these two, Aeschylus and Euripides, the tragic playwrights. Aeschylus is the older one from a couple of generations before, near the beginning of the later mid part of the 5th century BC, dating from the battles of Marathon and Salamis in the Persian Wars. So here we're talking about 70 years before the production of Frogs in 405 BC. Euripides is later and has in fact just passed away the year before the production of Frogs. Okay, so when Dionysus arrives into the Hall of Pluto, he's about to take Euripides back, but he discovers, and we're told, two slaves tell us this, that that these two are in a dispute of their own, because Aeschylus is the senior tragic playwright at Pluto's dining table. He has a special chair for the best tragic playwright. When Euripides shows up, however, Euripides tries to usurp that from Aeschylus. So the two of them are going back and forth, fighting about which one is in fact deserving of the chair. Dionysus, therefore, when he shows up, is appointed to be the judge in a contest between the two of them. And what Dionysus decides to do is to make the winner of that contest not only the one who will sit in this chair, but also the one who will go back to the above world with him to speak to the city of Athens. So it's important to recognize here that Dionysus changes his mind from originally taking Euripides back to deciding that he's going to use the contest to actually decide which one it's going to be. So the contest itself goes in essentially 5 phases. Actually 6 phases, really, if you count the very beginning. So first is just general back and forth arguing between the two of them. Then we get to description of what kind of plays they generally write. And it becomes clear that Aeschylus writes an older fashioned kind of Greek tragedy that is very difficult for the contemporary audience to Aristophanes to understand. It would be kind of the equivalent today of our trying to read Shakespeare or Chaucer or Spencer, when you're, especially even more so Beowulf. If you're trying to read Old English, even though it's the same language, it's still very hard for you to understand because the language is quite different from what you're used to. So Aeschylean Greek was like that to the Greeks, the Athenians of the later 5th century BC. So Aeschylean tragedy is very profound and very deep and very impressive, but it's very hard to understand it. Whereas Euripides writes tragedy that is much more contemporary, much easier to understand because the language is watered down. But Aeschylus doesn't like it because Euripides writes tragedy that's very filthy looking. Kings get dressed in rags. Ordinary citizens, like peasants, come up on stage and start giving long soliloquies and such. And so the art of tragedy looks much less noble than the way that it looked originally. So those are the general points made about the two playwrights. Then they start looking at their prologues, the way that they open the plays, and they get into disputes about how repetitious each one of them seems to be. Aeschylus ends up actually catching Euripides in a little trick, which is that it turns out that Euripides writes his prologues in this very systematic, perfunctory way in which all the prologues have exactly the same meter and the same setup. And Aeschylus is able to insert a phrase, Leukouthion Apollothon, which means he lost his bottle of oil, right at the end of each of the phrases, so that as Euripides keeps trying to recite his prologues, Aeschylus keeps interrupting with, he lost his bottle of oil, and it ends up making the prologue ridiculous. And Euripides can't find a prologue that Aeschylus can't do that to, so it shows how unimaginative Euripides' prologues are. So they go through that stage. Then there's a stage of musical composition, where Aeschylus has these rather wild and crazy beats that he uses in the meter, like these drum beats and then harp beats and such that sound like they don't belong where they're used. And again, they make the music very dramatic but hard to relate to. Whereas Euripides has a tendency to write metrically from many different sources and put them all together. And he ends up coming up with compositions that are rather random sounding. And so Aeschylus sings a spoof on that to show how that works. So that's the music. And then we get to the scales. We have a pair of scales. Both playwrights have to put words into the scale to see which one weighs more. So Euripides puts in things like, I wish the Argo had not made its way. And Aeschylus puts in things like the river is where cattle graze, and the river is very heavy. Then later on, Aeschylus puts in death, which is the heaviest ill. Then he puts in 2 chariots and 2 corpses, when all Euripides put in was this mace made of iron. So Aeschylus's words end up being really heavy. First is the river, because it weighs down wool. Then the death, which is really powerfully heavy. And then chariots and corpses. Once again, there's death in there, and the weight of the chariots is also quite mighty. So this goes back and forth, and none of this ends up helping Dionysus at all to decide which one he wants. It's interesting that he has not stayed with his original promise to take Euripides back. Now he's in a state of indecision. This is now where Alcibiades shows up on the scene, not in the play, but as a topic for conversation. Dionysus asks both playwrights to give him advice as to what the state of Athens should do about Alcibiades. And each one mumbles something about, well, maybe he was not trustworthy before, but I guess we need to use him now, and so forth. And so Dionysus says, okay, that's nice, but that still doesn't settle my question. So now he finally gives both playwrights a chance to say, how do we save the city of Athens? So Euripides tries a couple of things where he says, well, again, whoever was there before, I guess we can't trust them, so we need to get new people in, and so on. So then Dionysus finally turns to Aeschylus. Now, Aeschylus at first is skeptical to answer the question, how to save the city of Athens. He thinks it can't be saved. And he actually says to Dionysus, well, what kind of people are in there now? Are they useful people? And Dionysus says, where have you been? No, they're all worthless. They all cause trouble. And Aeschylus says, well, we can't save the city then. Well, Dionysus says, what? I need something from you. So Aeschylus says, well, back in my day, meaning probably Marathon and Salamis, they trusted their ships. Brilliant. He wins. So the point about all this, I think, is that, first of all, tragic playwrights and comic playwrights also serve a very special purpose in Athenian society. And it is kind of unfortunate to see old comedy trail off right after this. But in the 5th century BC, the 400s BC, tragic and comic playwrights serve the purpose of education for the Athenian people, and also frequently critique of Athenian policy, an attempt to redirect the Athenian populace to do something different from what they're currently doing. So this discussion between the two of them isn't only about the two different types of tragedy. In reality, in Athenian society, there really was room for both of them. And yes, of course, Euripides was constantly never winning, because he wrote a more kind of avant-garde form of tragedy that probably wasn't to the taste of the Athenians, and it did look sort of rather new-like and not necessarily respectful to the old models and such. But Euripides, nonetheless, was very highly regarded as a playwright for the fact that he even was able to compete, because most playwrights didn't have that opportunity. They weren't granted it by the Athenian populace. So that's the first point. The second point, though, is that Aristophanes really turns up the heat on the Athenian populace to tell them exactly what's needed. The point where he especially does this is in the parabasis delivered by the chorus directly to the Athenian audience, in which he compares the current Athenian leadership to the coins. What had happened was that the Athenians, because they were running out of precious metals, since they could not get access to them since the Spartans now held that territory, the Athenians now had been compelled to use baser metals for the minting of their coins. And in like manner, Aristophanes says, the current politicians in Athens are just as debased and just as corrupted or corruptible, and therefore to be not to be trusted, especially in the current circumstances with the war going on and with all of the exiles that had occurred previously, especially from the oligarchic coup. So in this state of affairs, the Athenians have to take a very strong look at themselves and at what's going on with their government, with their leadership, and to say, this is a war that we really have to try very hard to fight and win, or at least try not to suffer total defeat in. So whatever's been tried before apparently isn't working. We really need to try something else and someone else. So maybe we do need to bring back Alcibiades, and maybe we do need to bring back some of those other exiles. But whatever it is, we have to try something in order to turn things around. Probably had Dionysus brought back Euripides, and certainly with Dionysus bringing back Aeschylus, one of those playwrights could probably have spoken to the Athenian audience and given them a sense that they needed to change their ways in a very urgent manner. Well, of course, the Athenians applauded this play, gave it first place, and didn't listen to a word. And a few months later, they suddenly found themselves the objects of a very uncomfortable Spartan siege. That concludes our survey of the 5 plays of Aeschylus and the Peloponnesian Wars. In our next videos, we will now start talking about the sequel to the Peloponnesian War, what went on with the Athenians in the 4th century BC, to bring us down to the time of Menander and Greek New Comedy. We'll see you soon.